Everyone in town called her crazy when she sold the only barn her family had owned for 3 generations and used every single penny to buy 200 rabbits that were so ugly the breeder was about to send them to the glue factory. They were not the fluffy white bunnies you see in pet store windows with their pristine fur and twitching pink noses. They were mangy, lopsided, crossbred mutts with patchy fur and crooked ears that flopped in opposite directions like broken windshield wipers in a thunderstorm. Some had bald spots where old scars showed through. Others had teeth that grew at strange angles, giving them faces that looked permanently startled. One had only one eye. Another had a tail that bent at a right angle. The breeder had tried to sell them as pets and failed. He had tried to sell them for meat and been rejected by every processor in the state. He was literally loading them into a truck bound for a rendering plant when she walked into his barn and made him an offer he could not refuse. The auctioneer laughed out loud when she raised her paddle, a sharp barking sound that echoed through the dusty sale barn and made half the room turn to stare. Her own brother, a man who had inherited their father's conservative caution and their mother's sharp tongue, walked out of the sale barn, shaking his head and muttering under his breath that she had finally lost her mind after the divorce. That this was the final proof that stress had broken something inside her that could not be fixed. Her neighbor, a cattle rancher named Hank, who had 3,000 acres and a brand new Ford King ranch that he washed every single Saturday morning without fail, leaned against the fence after the deal closed and said he would give her 90 days before she was begging him for a loan to buy groceries. Before she came crawling back to reality with her tail between her legs like every other dreamer who thought they could outsmart the agricultural economy of the Great Plains. She did not cry. She did not defend herself. She did not offer explanations or excuses or try to make him understand the spreadsheets she had been building in the middle of the night for 6 straight months. She looked Hank straight in the eyes, handed the breeder a check for every dollar she had left in the world, and said that in exactly 18 months he would be the one asking her for advice, that he would be the one standing in her doorway, wondering how a woman with nothing but ugly rabbits and a broken barn had managed to build something he could not ignore. He laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his face, leaning against his truck for support, telling the small crowd that had gathered that this was the funniest thing he had heard in 20 years of farming. She was 42 years old, single, drowning in debt from a failed dairy operation that had collapsed under the weight of rising feed costs and falling milk prices. And now she was the proud owner of 200 of the most hideous rabbits anyone in rural Nebraska had ever laid eyes on. But here is what nobody understood. What not a single person in that sale barn could have guessed, even if they had studied her face for an hour. She had spent the previous 6 months in the darkest corner of her life, lying awake at 3 a.m. with the foreclosure notice pinned to her refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a cow, studying every single agricultural report she could find online through the spotty internet connection that came and went with the Nebraska wind. She had read USDA statistics until her eyes burned. She had called university extension offices in 3 different states. She had driven to libraries in towns she had never visited before, sitting in parking lots, using their Wi-Fi to download research papers about alternative livestock and niche meat markets, and the forgotten economics of small-scale protein production. And she had stumbled across a number that made her sit straight up in bed At 4 in the morning, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The United States imported over 50 million pounds of rabbit meat every single year, and domestic production had dropped by 32% in the last decade because nobody wanted to raise them anymore. The big commercial operations had abandoned the industry because they only wanted perfect specimens, purebred New Zealand whites with pristine fur and show-quality ears and pedigrees that read like royal bloodlines. The ugly ones, the crossbreeds, the rejects with crooked ears and patchy coats and teeth that grew wrong, they were being destroyed by the thousands because the industrial system had no use for imperfection. And that was the opportunity. That was the crack in the wall that she intended to blow wide open. With everything she had left. She did not have money for a fancy barn with climate control and automatic watering systems. She did not have money for veterinary contracts or nutrition consultants or brand designers. She had an old pole barn with holes in the roof that let the snow drift in during winter storms. A second-hand truck with 200,000 miles on it that smelled like diesel and regret. And a work ethic that came from growing up on a farm where you either figured it out or you starved. And there was no third option. So she loaded those 200 ugly rabbits into homemade cages built from scrap lumber. She pulled from the collapsed corner of her old dairy barn and old chicken wire she found rolled up in the back of her father's workshop. Tools he had left behind when he moved to Arizona with his new wife. She set them up in that drafty barn where the wind whistled through gaps in the tin siding. And she named her new operation Broken Ear Ranch after the crooked ears that everyone else thought were a joke, after the imperfection that she believed would become her greatest strength. The first tragedy hit exactly 11 days later, before she had even finished learning all their faces. A weasel got into the barn, through a gap she did not know existed. A hole no bigger than a softball hidden behind a stack of old hay bales. And in one single night, while she slept in the house 30 yards away, unaware of the slaughter happening in the dark, it killed 47 rabbits. She found them in the morning when she went out to feed before dawn, the sky still purple and orange along the eastern horizon, and the sight was so brutal that she sat down in the dirt and did not move for 2 hours. She just sat there in the cold morning air with blood on her boots and wondered if Hank had been right after all. The smell of death clung to her clothes for 3 days, no matter how many times she washed them, and she dreamed about those rabbits for months afterward. The weasel had not eaten them. It had killed for sport, the way predators sometimes do when they find easy prey in enclosed spaces. Bodies were scattered across the concrete floor. Blood had dried in dark patterns that looked like abstract paintings. Her daughter, who was 12, and had been helping her feed the animals before school every morning, who had already started naming the rabbits and talking to them like they were friends, took one look at the carnage and ran back to the house crying so hard she could not catch her breath. The girl locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out for the rest of the day. And when she finally emerged at dinner time, her eyes were still red and swollen. That was the first tragedy. The blood and the loss and the realization that her homemade setup was not just inadequate, it was dangerous. The second came 3 weeks after that, when the county inspector showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning, his government truck kicking up dust on the gravel driveway, and informed her that her homemade cages did not meet commercial standards for animal housing. He handed her a checklist with 27 violations and informed her that she had 14 days to replace the entire cage system, or face a shutdown order that would end her operation before it had even begun. The quote from the local welding shop for proper commercial cages made from galvanized wire was $14,000. She had less than $400 left in her checking account after buying feed and paying the electric bill on the barn. She spent 3 nights on the phone begging suppliers for credit, offering to trade future meat deliveries for materials, promising payment plans she was not sure she could keep, and getting rejected by everyone except one retired farmer 2 counties over who had a stack of old hog panels sitting in his back field, rusting into the ground. She drove over there with her daughter on a Saturday morning, loaded those rusted panels into her truck until the suspension groaned, and spent the next 9 days cutting and welding and cursing and bleeding from wire cuts and metal splinters until she had cages that would pass inspection. Her hands looked like she had been in a fight with a barbed wire fence. Her daughter helped by holding pieces steady and handing her tools, and they worked until after dark every night, eating sandwiches for dinner at 9 o'clock and falling into bed, too exhausted to shower. The third tragedy arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day when she thought things might finally be stabilizing. Her ex-husband, the man who had left her with the debt and the failing dairy in the first place, who had moved to the city and started a new life with a woman 10 years younger, filed a lawsuit claiming partial ownership of the property and demanding half of any profits she made from the rabbits. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, while she was ankle-deep in manure, trying to unclog a drain that had backed up during a rainstorm, and when she read them, she felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, like the earth itself was trying to throw her off. She could not afford a lawyer. She could not afford to lose the land that had been in her family since her great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1903. And she could not afford to stop working for even one single day to deal with legal paperwork, because the rabbits needed to be fed and watered and checked, and the world did not pause for personal crises. So she did what farm women have done since the beginning of time when the world fell apart around them. She put the papers in a drawer beneath her socks, worked until her hands shook from exhaustion, and figured she would deal with it when she had to, when the crisis became urgent enough that she could not ignore it anymore. Some nights she sat in her truck at the edge of the property and stared at the horizon, wondering if she had enough left inside her to survive another month, another week, another day. Those 3 tragedies, the weasel and the inspector and the lawsuit, they came at her like waves in a storm, each one bigger than the last, crashing over her head before she could catch her breath from the previous one. And every single person in town was waiting for her to quit. Hank stopped by every Saturday morning with a coffee from the gas station and a smirk that made her want to throw the cup at his truck, asking if she was ready to sell out yet, if she was ready to admit that rabbits were a joke and come back to real farming. Her brother stopped answering her calls entirely, sending her straight to voicemail every time. Even the feed store clerk, a kind woman named Doris, who had known her since childhood, started giving her pitying looks when she came in to buy rabbit pellets, the kind of look you give someone who is drowning and does not know it yet. But she did not quit. She reinforced every gap in that barn with hardware cloth she bought, with money she made, selling eggs from her last 6 chickens, the last remnants of her dairy operation. She learned to process the rabbits herself because the nearest USDA facility was 3 hours away, and she could not afford the transport costs or the processing fees. She built a walk-in cooler from an old chest freezer, a window air conditioner she found at a garage sale for $15, and a whole lot of insulation she scavenged from a demolished house on the edge of town, carrying it piece by piece in her truck until the neighbors thought she had lost her mind all over again. And slowly, painfully, those ugly rabbits started to multiply. The does bred and kindled and raised litters in those homemade cages. The numbers grew from 200 to 300 to 400. And she began to believe for the first time since she bought them that this might actually work. Now, before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something that has been on my mind. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city or your state in the comments, because I am genuinely curious how far this story is traveling across the internet. And I read every single comment that comes through, no matter how many there are. Whether you are in Texas, or Toronto, Nebraska, or Norway, California, or Colombia, I want to know who is out there listening to this incredible journey. So take 2 seconds right now and let me know where you are tuning in from. The first failure came 6 months in when she decided to try selling her rabbit meat directly to restaurants, cutting out the middleman and keeping the profit margin for herself. She loaded up her old truck with 200 pounds of frozen meat packed in coolers. With ice she bought from the gas station, drove 4 hours to Omaha, with her daughter in the passenger seat, keeping her company, and walked into 12 different kitchens with samples and price sheets, and a smile that felt more like a grimace. She was rejected by all 12, every single one. The chefs told her the same thing in slightly different words. They could not verify her supply chain. She was not USDA certified. The meat looked fine, smelled fine, probably tasted fine, but they needed liability insurance and traceability, and a brand they could put on the menu that would not make their customers nervous. One chef, a tall man with tattoos covering his arms, who ran a farm-to-table restaurant in the Old Market District, actually took pity on her and spent 10 minutes explaining what she needed to do to become restaurant-ready, drawing diagrams on napkins about HACCP plans and cold chain documentation. But the list was so long and expensive that she drove home in silence. For most of the 4 hours, the unsold meat slowly melting in coolers in the back, and when she got home, she sat in the driveway for 40 minutes before she could force herself to open the door and face the reality of another dead end. The second failure was even worse, because it came after a small taste of success. She had managed to secure a small contract with a local butcher shop in the nearby town that wanted to try carrying rabbit as a specialty item for their more adventurous customers. She delivered her first batch of 20 processed animals on a Friday morning, driving carefully because the road was icy, and she felt a flutter of real hope for the first time in months. By Monday, the butcher called her in a panic, his voice tight and angry. 3 customers had complained that the meat was tough, stringy, difficult to chew. When she investigated, calling the customers herself to apologize and ask questions, she realized she had been processing the rabbits at the wrong age. She had been butchering them at 16 weeks, when they should have been harvested at 12 weeks for optimal tenderness. A mistake born from ignorance and lack of mentorship in an industry that had no veterans left to teach newcomers. The butcher cancelled the contract on the spot and told her he could not risk his reputation on an amateur who did not know the basics. She had spent 3 months building that relationship, driving samples back and forth, adjusting her prices, learning his preferences, and it was gone in a single phone call that lasted less than 90 seconds. The third failure nearly ended everything and left her questioning whether she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She had been posting on social media, trying to build a direct-to-consumer brand, sharing photos of her operation and her daughter and the ugly rabbits with their crooked ears. And she finally got her first major order. A private chef in Colorado who was planning a high-end dinner party for 30 people wanted 50 whole rabbits dressed and packaged professionally. She stayed up for 36 hours straight processing and packaging the order, her hands cramping from the knife work, her back aching from bending over the table, her daughter helping by printing labels and packing dry ice. She drove it to the shipping depot herself, paid extra for overnight delivery with money she did not really have, and collapsed into bed thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The package arrived late because of a snowstorm in the mountains. The dry ice had sublimated hours before delivery, and the meat spoiled before it reached the kitchen, arriving at room temperature with a smell that made the chef gag. The chef sent her photos of rotting rabbit carcasses, laid out on stainless steel counters, and threatened to post them online with her business name attached if she did not issue a full refund immediately plus compensation for the ruined dinner party. She did not have the money for the refund. She had already spent it on feed and cage repairs and the shipping costs. She sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m, with her head in her hands, staring at the bank account balance that showed less than $80. And she honestly did not know if she could do it anymore. Her daughter found her there the next morning, still in the same clothes she had been wearing the day before, still staring at the same screen, her face pale and hollow-eyed. The girl did not say a word. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders, and held her for a long time. And then, without saying a single word, the girl went outside and started feeding the rabbits herself, carrying water buckets and hay bundles with a determination that looked too large for her small frame. That was the moment. That was the accidental discovery that changed everything. Because when her daughter went out to feed the rabbits that morning, she was not just dumping pellets into trays with mechanical efficiency. She was talking to them. She had named every single one of them, the ugly ones with the crooked ears and the patchy fur and the strange teeth. And she treated them like pets instead of livestock, like individuals instead of inventory. And because she spent so much time with them, because she sat with them and sang to them and let them climb on her lap, she noticed something that her mother had missed in all the chaos of processing and marketing and fighting lawsuits and trying to survive. The rabbits were calmer when she sang to them. They bred more successfully when she handled them daily, when they recognized her scent and her voice. And most importantly, they grew faster and healthier when they were not stressed, when they were not rushed or frightened or handled roughly. Her mother had been treating them like a commodity, like meat on a timeline, and the stress of that approach was literally showing up in the quality of the meat, in the texture and the flavor and the consistency that chefs and customers were rejecting. The daughter had stumbled into something that the industrial rabbit operations had forgotten in their pursuit of efficiency and volume. Stress hormones change the texture and flavor of meat. Animals that are handled gently, that live in low-stress environments, that are not rushed through process transported long distances while conscious, produce meat that is noticeably more tender and flavorful. It was not just about the breed or the feed or the processing age. It was about the entire life experience of the animal, from birth to harvest, every moment of fear or calm imprinting itself on the cells that would eventually become food. And that insight became the foundation of everything that followed. The philosophy that would define her brand, and her method, and her success. She completely rebuilt her operation around low-stress handling, around the idea that respect for the animal was not just ethical but practical, not just moral but profitable. She stopped rushing the rabbits through processing, and instead developed a method where they were handled by the same person from birth to harvest. Never transported long distances while conscious, and processed on-site in a quiet room with familiar smells and sounds that did not trigger panic. She called it the broken ear method, and it became her signature, her brand, her religion. The transformation happened year by year, and each year built on the last like layers of sediment turning into stone, like rings in a tree that tell the story of every season. In year 1, she went from 200 rabbits to 800, and she finally paid off the last of the dairy debt that had been crushing her for 5 years, the debt that had kept her awake at night and made her feel like a failure as a mother and a farmer and a human being. She bought a proper walk-in cooler instead of the hacked-together chest freezer setup that had nearly ruined her Colorado order. She hired her first employee, a local teenager named Marcus, who had dropped out of high school and needed a second chance, who showed up every day on time and worked harder than anyone she had ever met. Marcus had been written off by teachers and employers alike, but she saw something in him that others had missed, and he repaid her faith by becoming the most reliable person on the farm. By year 5, he had become her operations manager, overseeing daily logistics, training new hires, and helping design the expanded processing facility that would handle their explosive growth during the crisis years. In year 2, she got her USDA certification after 18 months of paperwork and inspections, and more paperwork than she thought existed in the world. And she started selling to 3 restaurants in Omaha that had rejected her the first time around. The chefs noticed the difference in the meat immediately. They said the texture was unlike any rabbit they had ever worked with, tender and delicate, with a sweetness that spoke of calm animals and careful handling. One of them, a James Beard nominee, with a restaurant that had a 6-month waiting list, put her rabbit on the menu as a permanent feature, and started telling other chefs about the woman in Nebraska, with the ugly rabbits, and the strange method that produced meat unlike anything they had tasted before. In year 3, she expanded to 1,200 breeding does, and started supplying a specialty meat distributor that served high-end grocery stores in Denver and Kansas City. She bought the land next door, 20 acres of overgrown pasture that nobody wanted because it was too hilly for corn and too rocky for cattle, and turned it into rotational grazing paddocks, where the rabbits spent part of each day in outdoor colony pens, eating fresh grass and clover and dandelions and living like rabbits were meant to live instead of existing in cages their entire lives. In year 4, she launched her direct-to-consumer website with professional photos and a story page that explained the broken ear method. And she sold out her first batch of 1,000 processed rabbits in less than 48 hours. The demand was so overwhelming that she had to implement a waitlist system, and the waitlist grew to 6 months within 3 weeks. Food bloggers started writing about her, sending photographers to her farm to capture the strange beauty of ugly rabbits living peaceful lives. a national magazine sent a photographer to her farm for a feature story that ran 8 pages, and Hank, the cattle rancher who had laughed at her in the beginning, who had offered her loans and smirks and pity, showed up at her gate one morning with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, and asked if she had any advice for someone looking to diversify their operation, because the cattle market was getting harder every year and he was watching his margins shrink while she seemed to be growing something real. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of his laughter or his predictions. She invited him in for coffee and told him everything she had learned, every mistake and every breakthrough, because she believed that success was not a competition but a community. By year 5, Broken Ear Ranch was processing over 10,000 rabbits annually, employing 8 people full-time, including Marcus, who was now her operations manager, and supplying meat to 47 restaurants across 7 states. She had paid off the property completely, including the 20 acres she had added, and she had enough savings in the bank to weather 2 bad years without the panic that had defined her early life. The lawsuit from her ex-husband had been dismissed when he realized there were no profits to claim in the early years. And by the time the operation was successful, he had no legal standing to touch it because she had structured everything properly with the help of a lawyer she could finally afford. Her daughter, the girl who had fed the rabbits and named them and taught her mother the most important lesson of all, was now 17 and running the social media and customer service side of the business with a skill and authenticity that made marketing consultants ask who they had hired and how much they were paying her. And then the meat crisis hit. In the spring of year 6, a combination of avian influenza outbreaks that wiped out millions of chickens across the Midwest, supply chain disruptions that made beef transport unreliable and expensive, and skyrocketing feed prices that pushed cattle operations to the brink of bankruptcy created a perfect storm in the American meat industry. Beef prices jumped 40% in 3 months. Chicken became scarce in major grocery stores, with empty shelves where poultry used to sit in endless rows. Pork production slowed due to foreign disease concerns that made importation risky. And suddenly, almost overnight, Americans who had never considered eating rabbit before, who had thought of it as something foreign, or old-fashioned or strange, were searching for alternative protein sources. The phone at Broken Ear Ranch rang off the hook from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. National distributors who had ignored her emails and calls for years were now offering contracts with advance payments that would have covered her entire first year of operation. A major meal kit company wanted 50,000 pounds of rabbit meat over the next 12 months, a number so large she had to sit down when she heard it. A venture capital firm contacted her about scaling the operation nationally, offering millions in investment for a minority stake. And the most beautiful part of all of this was that she was ready. She had spent 5 years building a system that was resilient, humane, and scalable. A system designed for growth from the very beginning, because she had believed in it even when nobody else did. She had the breeding stock, 1,200 does, with genetics selected for temperament and health and meat quality. She had the processing facility, built to her exact specifications with the Broken Ear method at its core. She had the brand recognition and the customer loyalty and the operational knowledge that came from making every mistake herself and learning from each one, while the rest of the meat industry was scrambling to adapt to a crisis they never saw coming. panicking and raising prices and cutting corners. She was already sitting on the answer, already prepared, already positioned to meet the need. She signs a strategic partnership with a network of small farms across the Midwest, teaching them the broken ear method and providing breeding stock from her own lines. And within 18 months, there were over 50 small operations raising rabbits using her system, creating a distributed network of humane rabbit production that could meet demand without concentrating risk in one location. These farmers became her extended family, sharing knowledge and resources, creating a community of practice that transformed the entire regional meat landscape. She did not franchise. She did not sell out to the venture capitalists. She built a coalition of independent farmers who shared her values and her methods. And together, they created a domestic rabbit meat supply chain that could actually meet the sudden surge in demand without sacrificing quality or ethics. The numbers tell the rest of the story better than words ever could. In the first year of the meat crisis, Broken Ear Ranch and its partner farms produced and sold over 200,000 pounds of rabbit meat. The average price per pound reached $14 at retail, nearly double what she had been charging before the crisis, and customers paid it gladly because the alternative was empty plates or protein they could not afford. She expanded her processing facility to handle 5,000 rabbits per week, hiring 12 more people from the local community, and providing jobs that paid above minimum wage with benefits she had never had herself. And perhaps most impressively, she turned down 3 separate acquisition offers from major meat corporations because she believed that keeping the operation independent and values-driven was worth more than any paycheck. Because she had seen what happened when corporations controlled food production, and she refused to become part of that system. Today, Broken Ear Ranch is one of the most respected names in alternative protein in the United States, featured in documentaries and textbooks and business case studies at agricultural universities. The woman who sold her barn to buy 200 ugly rabbits is now a sought-after speaker at agricultural conferences, a mentor to dozens of young farmers who come to her farm for week-long internships, and the author of a book about resilient farming that has sold over 50,000 copies and is used in university courses from Nebraska to California. Her daughter is studying veterinary medicine at a prestigious university and plans to come back to the farm after graduation to help expand the operation into education and agritourism, building a legacy that will outlast them both. And those original 200 rabbits, the mangy, lopsided, crooked-eared mutts that everyone laughed at, that the breeder was going to destroy, they are the genetic foundation of a breeding program that now supplies some of the highest quality rabbit stock in the country. Stock that is valued not for perfect ears or pristine fur, but for temperament and health, and the ability to thrive in low-stress environments. Hank, the cattle rancher, is now one of her closest friends and business partners. And he will tell anyone who listens that the smartest investment he ever made was swallowing his pride and asking that crazy rabbit lady for advice, that she taught him more about farming in one afternoon than he had learned in 20 years of doing it the conventional way. So here is the lesson, and it is the same lesson that every great farming story teaches us in the end if we are willing to listen. The opportunity that everyone else overlooks is usually the one that changes everything. Those ugly rabbits were not a joke. They were not a mistake or a sign of desperation or proof of a broken mind. They were a market inefficiency, A gap between what the industrial sisters want and what the market actually needed. She saw it because she was desperate enough to look where nobody else was looking, and she was stubborn enough to keep going when everyone around her was waiting for her to fail, when every signal in her environment told her to quit and go back to safety. If you are sitting there right now, with an idea that everyone is laughing at, with a dream that looks impossible on paper, with a vision that does not fit the conventional wisdom of your industry or your town or your family or your own fear, then listen carefully to what I am about to say. The meat crisis did not make her successful. It did not create her opportunity or build her foundation or give her the skills she needed. It only revealed the success she had already built. It shone a spotlight on the foundation that was there because she laid it brick by brick during the years when nobody was watching and nobody cared and nobody believed. Crisis does not create opportunity. It exposes the opportunity that was already there, waiting for someone prepared enough to seize it, ready enough to meet it, stubborn enough to outlast the darkness. So start building your foundation today. Start laying your bricks in the dark, in the quiet, in the years when nobody is cheering for you, and nobody sees what you are doing, and nobody believes it will work. Build anyway. Work anyway. Believe anyway. Because when your moment comes, and it will come, maybe not in the form you expect, and maybe not on the timeline you want, the only thing that matters is whether you are ready. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that the hardest paths often lead to the most beautiful destinations, that the things people laugh at today might be the things they admire tomorrow, then hit that like button and subscribe, because there are 100 more stories just like this one waiting to be told. Stories of people who built something impossible out of nothing but stubbornness, and vision, and the refusal to quit when quitting would have been the easy choice. Drop a comment below and tell me what impossible dream you are working on right now. I read every single one, and I believe in you even if nobody else does yet. Until the next story, keep building, keep believing, and remember that the ugliest rabbits sometimes make the most beautiful miracles. Your moment is coming. The darkness you are walking through right now is simply the path to a light that only you can reach. Do not stop. Do not quit. The world needs what you are building.